You were born in a small town where the bitter winter stretched on for 8 months, and summer's warmth was little more than a half-hearted promise the land made. Your eyesight was unlike anyone else's. Your father noticed it when you were 10 years old. You struck a bird in flight with a stone from 40 meters away. He said nothing complimentary. Men of his generation never spoke of talent aloud. But the next day, he took you into the mountains to hunt and let you carry the rifle in honor that should have belonged only to the eldest son. That was when everything quietly began, though you had no idea of it at the time. At 18, the military found you. The Soviet call-up of 1942 waited for no one. They handed you a Mosin Nagant rifle, 4 kilograms of steel that carried the scent of gun oil and the residue of countless hands before yours. You received only 2 days of training. In better prepared units, that same training would have lasted 2 months, but time was the one thing the Soviets had none of. An instructor whose face looked far older than his years, carrying the urgency of a man who knew there'd be no second lesson, taught you exactly one thing: wait. Don't pull the trigger until you're absolutely certain of your target. Don't confirm your target until it has stayed perfectly still for 30 seconds. And before you fire, you yourself must remain motionless for 30 minutes. Patience was your only protection because real protective gear had already been shipped off to the Ural industrial region months earlier. They sent you to Stalingrad. The city no longer resembled itself, only a broken skeleton remained, shattered concrete, twisted rebar, the air thick with the smell of burning and the weight of frozen fear. Your first sniping position was a gap between 2 collapsed beams, roughly the size of a small coffin. No one ever mentioned the metaphor buried in that coincidence. November's cold in Stalingrad was nothing like the cold back home. This cold had teeth that gnawed at you, reached its icy fingers inside your body, and closed tight around your lungs. You couldn't move, or you'd give yourself away. You couldn't complain, because your own breath, visible in the freezing air, would betray your position just as easily. You lay motionless for 6 hours straight, your bladder at its limit, your fingers numb around the rifle. Then, your first target appeared, an enemy soldier crossing an open stretch between 2 ruined walls, only 30 meters away, close enough that you could have shouted something at him. You pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the ruins and slammed into your shoulder before you even registered the recoil. When you lowered your scope, the soldier had already dropped, without so much as a final tremor. You didn't feel what you expected to feel. No triumph. No guilt, not yet. Only adrenaline surging through your veins like boiling water and a tight knot in your stomach. And most importantly, one thought struck you instantly. That gunshot had just revealed your position to the entire enemy line. You had to move immediately. Within 30 seconds, they'd be pouring fire onto the coordinates the shot came from. You ran hunched through the rubble, tripping and falling and scrambling back up again and again, the rifle pressed tight against your body as though it were the only real thing left in this chaos. That night, you and 12 other comrades slept in a basement. No one spoke of what had happened that day. Tomorrow, you'd do the same thing again. And the day after that, too. It seemed like every day from then on would go the same way, the days accumulating through an endless cycle of lying in wait and pulling the trigger. They changed you in ways you had no way of measuring because you no longer had any version of yourself left to compare against. You were promoted to sergeant not because anyone formally evaluated your abilities, but because everyone above you had already fallen on the battlefield. Bullets create vacancies. So does internal attrition. To a mathematician, the rate at which the Soviet system consumed its own men would look catastrophic in any other context, but in the ruins of Stalingrad, there was no other context to speak of. As a sergeant sniper in Stalingrad, you'd already mastered countless techniques no manual ever recorded. You knew that at certain times of day, sunlight would flash off an enemy sniper's scope. That split-second glint was enough to pinpoint his location. You knew enemy snipers had better training and more advanced scopes, but no technical advantage could compensate for the carelessness of casually lighting a cigarette in position. You knew you could stare at a single blind spot for hours, waiting for an enemy to make exactly that mistake. And you also knew that somewhere across the ruins, someone else was doing the exact same thing, with you as his target. Sniper duels were nothing like how films decades later would portray them. There was no fast-paced exchange, no well-timed dramatic climax. At its core, there was only waiting, counting the bricks in a wall, calculating the angle of a shadow, endlessly asking yourself whether that body lying 400 meters away had truly lost its life, or whether it was bait deliberately placed there, just waiting for you to move carelessly. The only answer was to keep watching. 1 hour. 2 hours. If the body never moved even slightly, then he really was dead. Vasily Zaytsev wasn't a born legend. He came from the Ural Mountains, a boy who learned to hunt lost animals in the snow alongside his grandfather. What set him apart from others wasn't marksmanship precision, but his tactical mind, using the glint off a scope to draw out bait, calculating a bullet's trajectory before ever pulling the trigger, treating the entire battlefield as a language only a select few could decipher. In his first few months on the battlefield, he racked up 225 confirmed kills. The Soviet system turned him into a propaganda symbol, a portrayal not entirely fabricated, but one that, with a precision every sniper would recognize, carefully filtered out the brutal details. At some point in your transition from raw recruit to sergeant, you began operating in two-man teams, a sniper paired with a spotter. The spotter searches for targets, calculates distance, measures wind speed, and confirms the sniping position hasn't been discovered. The sniper pulls the trigger, and in that exact second after firing, he becomes the most vulnerable man on the battlefield, because all his attention is locked onto the target, with none left over for whatever danger might be creeping up behind him. The trust between the two of you had long since surpassed anything professional. It's a trust deeper than anything, with a name in peacetime, because peacetime never demands that kind of absolute mutual surrender. Your spotter knew things your own family never did. He knew how your breathing would slow right before you fired. He knew the particular silence you fell into while calculating trajectory. He knew whether you were having a good day or a bad one, even if you never said a word, because some things simply don't need to be spoken. While you were learning all this in the ruins of the Soviet Union, in the forests of Finland, a corporal was doing something completely different, yet somehow arriving at the same place. Simo Häyhä was born of the forest, and the forest regarded him as one of its own. He was dressed head to toe in white camouflage. He never used a scope, because glass reflects sunlight off the snow, and even the faintest glint would be enough to give away his position. He used iron sights instead, since at 300 meters no finer instrument was needed, and dull metal would never betray his location. He kept snow in his mouth, so the condensation of his breath wouldn't expose his position before he'd locked onto his target. The Soviets sent 450,000 troops into Finland, a country with a total population of only 1.2 million. On paper, the odds looked hopeless, unless you factored in the forests, the snow, and men who had spent their entire lives hunting moose in temperatures of 30 below zero. In 98 days, he recorded 505 confirmed kills. Fire, relocate, ambush again 2 kilometers away, relocate once more. By the time the enemy organized a counterattack, he had already vanished into the silence of a forest 3 kilometers away. He slept in the snow, because snow preserved body heat better than any makeshift shelter. He ate frozen black bread, chipping off pieces bit by bit with a knife. The emotion he felt in that forest is difficult to define with ordinary words. It was a kind of calm. A nearly cold, detached calm, the peculiar gift the forest bestows only on men who've lived in it long enough. Later, an explosive struck his jaw. He survived by pure chance, his face partially reconstructed. When the war ended, he was only 25 years old, and he spent the rest of his life in silence, accompanied only by a number that no one ever dared to ask him about. Back on the Soviet front, your promotions never stopped, until you eventually became a major. By then, you no longer operated as a lone soldier. You had a radio and a map updated by hand every night, marking everything your observers had scouted during the day. You now coordinated multiple sniper teams rather than fighting as one of them yourself. Urban sniping in Stalingrad held a paradox. On open ground, sniping distances required no specialized marksman at all. Any infantryman with decent accuracy would do. But in Stalingrad, the crumbling wall separating you from your target was the entire difference between seeing and being seen. The Univermag department store, the tractor factory, once thriving industrial landmarks, were now nothing but rubble. In the basement of a former theater, 50 men were crammed together in conditions so wretched that even an ordinary rat would have turned up its nose. It was in these cramped spaces that you coordinated all your sniper teams, responsible for the safety and movements of everyone under your command. That weight of responsibility was heavier than the 4-kilogram Mosin-Nagant rifle had ever been. At this level, regret began quietly seeping in. It always arrived at a certain hour, usually 4 in the morning, when the mind lacked enough tasks to suppress the emotions lying dormant beneath the surface. But a Soviet officer could never let regret show, because showing regret was a sign of weakness, and weakness earned no sympathy, only suspicion. You could only process that emotion privately, in silence, in the gaps between shots, when your mind went blank for a moment and some nameless heaviness would slip in to fill the void. On the enemy side, in the Carpathian mountains, a corporal was doing the same thing you were, only from the opposite side, and with a different scope. Matthäus Hetzenauer was only 21 years old, carrying a Karabiner 98K rifle fitted with a ZF-41 4X scope that let him see a target's face clearly from 800 meters away. That distance let him see far more detail than anyone should ever have to see, and that clarity came with a price no one had anticipated. He fought in the mountains, where nighttime temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees. While Soviet artillery pounded the skies by day. Among his recorded shots were several beyond 1,000 meters a distance most shooting instructors would consider impossible to calculate without instrumentation, given the complex mountain terrain. Yet he did it with nothing but his own eyes, relying on months of accumulated experience with that same mountain range and that same pattern of wind winds he knew as intimately as his own breathing. His confirmed kill count reached 345 confirmed, meaning verified by witnesses and formally recorded, since the enemy army never accepted a kill without evidence. In a destroyed village that no one would ever remember the name of, they briefly awarded him the Knight's Cross. His comrades raised their glasses of gin in celebration, while he found himself replaying those 345 shots in his mind, moments that could easily have missed, but by chance had struck true. He also thought back to enemy bullets that had grazed past his ear, close enough to feel the air tremble. A medal never changed a single thing about any of that. Hetzenauer had already understood by 1944 exactly what you had known since 1943, that the enemy would inevitably lose this war. For him, that meant fighting was no longer about victory, but about the fact that his comrades were still holding on. Abandoning them was something no strategic logic could ever have made him do. For you, it meant holding your ground, because holding the line was the only barrier standing against the enemy's advance, the only thing protecting Moscow. Two men, on opposite ends of the same war, both suffering the same bone-gnawing cold in their fingers, both learning the same forced patience out of sheer necessity, both carrying secrets they would never speak of to anyone once the war ended. Among your own ranks, there were many women doing exactly the same work as you, and doing it just as well. In 1942, that was still a fact many superiors had to slowly come to accept. Over the course of the war, a total of 2,000 Soviet women served as snipers. This wasn't some experiment. nor an exception. It was a necessary policy adopted by a nation whose manpower was running so dangerously low that every other consideration had become irrelevant. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had already recorded 309 kills by age 25, after which she was pulled from the front lines and sent on a speaking tour of the United States. She met with Eleanor Roosevelt and gave speeches at public gatherings. American journalists never asked about her tactics or sniping positions. Instead, they asked what makeup she used. Pavlichenko studied the expressions on their faces. Seen one way, it was endless patience. Seen another way, it was restrained contempt. Before that speaking tour and those trivial questions, there had been the battlefield of Sevastopol, month after month, lying on Ukrainian soil, enduring the brutal summer heat, letting dust invade her eyes. The men in her unit had been skeptical of her at first, a skepticism that lasted only until they saw her results no different from any male snipers. Bullets never asked the shooter's gender. Your own promotions continued until you eventually reached the rank of major. Ivan Sidorenko's kill count was somewhere around 500, a number so vast it had already lost any concrete texture. A single shot is something specific. It has an angle, a distance, a wind, a target, a result. But 500 shots is just an abstract number. The human brain cannot process 500 individual lives lost in any emotional way. At first, he tried to. Later, he stopped, because the attempt itself became a tactical liability. A sniper who, while lining up a shot, is still thinking about how many men he's already killed simply cannot control the tremor in his trigger finger. But at this level, you were no longer just a shooter, you were also an instructor. Sidorenko trained more than 250 snipers. His students went on to take lives, and so did their students in turn. Fear compounded like interest, accumulating endlessly, with no ledger capable of tallying it all. Serving as an instructor here meant teaching knowledge no manual ever recorded, because manuals were usually written by people who had never set foot on a real battlefield. You taught your students to read the snow, to distinguish the tracks left by Soviet boots from enemy boots, to judge how long ago a trail was left based on the temperature. When choosing between two sniping positions, you taught them to consider not just the firing angle, but also to plan an escape route, because a gunshot would always give away your location. You felt a kind of exhaustion, one that was no longer physical. Physical fatigue was something you'd grown familiar with from your very first day on the battlefield. You had long since learned to ignore it. This exhaustion was different, the heavy weariness of having carried too much for too long, of knowing too intimately how death arrives from a distance. On the northern front, Soviet naval infantry were defending the besieged city of Leningrad. The 900-day siege pushed hunger to a physiological extreme the body should never have been able to endure, yet it stubbornly survived anyway, because the body is more stubborn than any rational calculation. Naval snipers carried the same equipment as their army counterparts, endured the same brutal cold and hunger, but the sea introduced variables that open ground never had. Sea winds, shaped by the interplay of water and air temperature, could shift in speed and direction within an instant. A sniper on the steppe might master the local wind patterns within a few weeks. On the coastline, it could take a person years to fully understand them. But war never gives anyone years, so everyone simply had to adapt on the fly. You lay in wait, firing from a position facing Lake Ladoga. On the far shore lay hope for survival. The winter convoys crossing the ice were the lifeline sustaining a city on the brink of starvation. You guarded that road with your rifle, pulling the trigger with fingers numbed senseless by the cold. By 1944, on the Normandy battlefield, the British arrived with the Lee-Enfield No-4 rifle. The tactical doctrine they brought was late to arrive, but proved effective the moment it was put into practice. Normandy's hedgerows were either heaven or hell for a sniper, depending entirely on which side you were on. Those 3-meter-high hedgerows, planted by Normans over centuries to divide their fields, became, in the summer of 1944, The most perfect natural camouflage network imaginable, a defensive barrier no military architect could ever have designed. A single enemy soldier hidden behind a hedgerow, armed with nothing but a rifle, could halt an entire company's advance for hours. And a British sniper, positioned on the opposite side, was doing exactly the same thing in return. Edgar Roberts could fire with precision from 365 meters, a distance at which, with a good enough scope, you could even make out the color of a target's eyes. Many snipers deliberately avoided looking at a target's eyes, a decision with understandable reasoning behind it, though never once written into any official report. The Americans arrived on that same battlefield carrying the Springfield M1903 rifle, but without any single, unified tactical doctrine. On the Pacific Front, this meant that in the jungles of Guadalcanal, soldiers always had to keep their eyes turned upward and alert. Because enemy shooters often hid in the trees, danger came from the sky rather than the horizon. That kind of experience rewires a person's nervous system in a specific way, a change that would persist for decades after the war ended. In restaurants in 1952, there was always an old veteran sitting in the corner, eyes fixed on the door. They never looked at the ceiling, and they never explained why, because explaining would have required describing the particular sound tropical leaves make 12 meters up, and that kind of talk was never fit for a dinner table. On May 5, 1945, the enemy formally surrendered. The system that had shaped you had, from the very start, been quietly counting its own numbers. 428,335 Soviets received sniper training, 9,534 earned advanced certification. The enemy army required a witness to verify every single kill. Finnish snipers fought alone in forests where no one ever verified anything, accompanied only by silence after each shot. The British sniper system got a late start, but eventually became fully systematized. The Americans, meanwhile, relied more on individual soldiers' natural talent than on any collective doctrine improvisation, with results ranging wildly between brilliant and negligible, depending entirely on the man. No system, anywhere, ever kept a record of the dreams that came afterward. Whether it was the Soviet quota counting, the enemy's verification records, or the Finns' silence, all of them overlooked that one thing. Vasily Zaytsev survived. After the war, he worked as a textile engineer in Kiev and passed away in 1991, just days before the collapse of the country he had once served. Lyudmila Pavlichenko survived and passed away in 1974. Simo Häyhä survived, his jaw partially reconstructed, living to the age of 96 in the forests of Finland, having spent almost his entire life never speaking of his past. Matthäus Hetzenauer survived, returning to Austria after the war. All of them shared something in common, something psychologists spent decades finding the right words to describe, and something the veterans themselves rarely spoke of, because describing it requires a listener with a compatible frame of reference. And spending 500 hours lying in the snow, waiting for someone to enter your field of view, then taking their life with a precisely calculated angle that's a frame of reference most listeners simply cannot bring into a conversation. So they chose silence instead. They worked hard, built families, and then, in the darkness of 4 a.m, when their minds uncontrollably replayed the past, they would find themselves back on that battlefield once more in the snow, amid the ruins, rifle resting against something solid, finger hovering over the trigger guard, breath timed between heartbeats, waiting as they always had. A sniper has no final rank. He only has his final shot. And after that final shot comes an entire lifetime spent trying to remember what he was even like before he ever pulled the trigger the first time. That patience you learned on the battlefield was never a skill you could hand back in along with your uniform. It reshaped your nervous system permanently. It stays with you forever, present in the moment your hands should tremble but never do again, in the way your eyes still unconsciously measure distances no one will ever ask you to measure, in the lifelong habit of always sitting with your back to the wall, facing the door. It's such a small, such a precise gesture that anyone who noticed it in a restaurant in 1952 could never have understood what image flashed before your eyes as you stared at that door, that gap between two breaths. That single moment that had once decided everything, still there, still present.